Hi, everyone. Welcome. So this is James, and I'm Kristin. I feel like maybe half of you weren't here last week. Raise your hand if you weren't here last week. Okay, a few people. Okay, so we're going to start out just with a quick review for you all. Last week we went through some beautiful logic from 9th century Buddhist master Shantideva. And he talks about how our true enemy is not something outside, it's the own mental afflictions in our minds. And the place that we need to fight them is in our minds, right? So he says even the worst tyrant or the person in your life who disturbs you the most, right? Without you doing anything, they're going to fade out of your life, or they're going to die. Somehow they're going to go away, right? But your mental afflictions, you constantly regenerate them. That's the nature of mental afflictions. Someone criticizes you, and your natural reaction is to criticize them back. Something disturbs your mind, and then you tend to think about what's disturbing you over and over and over again, right? You're always regenerating your mental afflictions, and they stay in your mind, and they keep regenerating. And these things you carry with you, right? So they're the real enemy. And the Buddha says, in a sutra, it's called the Deer Sutra, he says, when seized by the end maker, as you abandon the human state, what's truly your own? What do you take along when you go? What follows behind you like a shadow that never leaves? Both the merit and evil that you as a mortal perform here, that's what's truly your own, what you take along when you go. That's what follows behind you like a shadow that never leaves. So do what is admirable as an accumulation for the future life. So Master Shantideva also proposes a really cool thought experiment. He says, suppose someone comes and they hit you with a stick. You know, you should get mad at the stick because the stick is the thing that hurts, right? And then he says, well, no, maybe you should get mad at the person because the person is wielding the stick, right? You should be mad at the person. And then he says, what's wielding the person? Mental afflictions are wielding the person. So you should get mad at mental afflictions, right? You can separate mental afflictions from the person. We talked last week about how the nature of our minds is not mental affliction. The nature of our minds is much more like clear blue sky, right? Mental afflictions are like temporary storm clouds that come in. They can be cleared with love, with wisdom, with compassion, right?
So once you see that mental afflictions are the only real enemy, and again, last week we went into a lot of different proofs for that. But then the Buddha and Master Shantideva, they want you to go to war against the mental afflictions. They don't want you to give mental afflictions an inch. You can't coddle mental afflictions. Like there's no, I'm just going to be patient with them, okay? You can't be gentle with mental afflictions. They are the cause of all the suffering in the world. They're the enemy, you have to stop them. And so we talked a little bit last week about the essence of the monastic approach, which is, I'm not going to give mental afflictions an inch. You draw a line, and whatever is kind of triggering you, whatever is causing you trouble, causing the enemy to be able to enter your mind, you let go of, and you restrain yourself from. So much of kind of the monastic approach is about letting go of attachments, letting go of desires, letting go of the things that trigger the mental afflictions and allow the mental afflictions to invade your mind. Master Shantideva, for those of you that don't know, he's the great 8th century Buddhist saint who gave this tremendous teaching called The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. He's quite vociferous about not giving mental affliction an inch. He has a beautiful verse in The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life where he says, "You can tie me to a stake and burn me, kill me, or you can cut off my head. That would be fine. But I will never in any shape or form submit to my great enemy, the mental afflictions." So last week we discussed a very profound technique that Master Shantideva used to keep mental afflictions from gaining an edge. So we talked about teaming up recollection of enlightened qualities with mindfulness. Your mind is just being a sentry to be like, is the enemy there? Is the enemy approaching? Okay, now I'm going to move my mind to someplace safe. And Kristin called it last week the positivity force field, which is just thinking about enlightened qualities. Did anybody have an opportunity to work with this at all this coming week when your mind was starting to get a little bit upset and just kind of moving your mind? Yeah, good, good. So you see that it's a very powerful technique. You see that the mind can only hold one idea, like a light switch, at a time. And the more you meditate, the more you become more and more aware of this. You see the thoughts slow down, and you see it's, you can toggle. In retreat, we had a funny phrase called micro-toggling. Okay. You can micro-toggle, but it's only one image at a time. So that's a quick top-line review of last week. Now, Buddhism is very broad and it's very deep. It's aimed at ending suffering and the causes of suffering for everyone. But because our minds are so different at different times, because there's so many mental afflictions to fight, Buddhism has to be very broad and very deep to attack all the different mental afflictions. Many of us have seen the verses that say there's 84,000 mental afflictions, which to them was like kind of like the biggest number they could conceive, and that was like, okay, it's infinite. That's what they meant. Okay. So Buddhism has, you can take all the different approaches and you could boil it down into 3 main approaches for how to fight mental afflictions. And the first one is the monastic approach, which we talked about last week. Restraining, letting go, not giving mental afflictions an inch. Then there's the Bodhisattva approach, which we're going to talk about this week. And this is about not abandoning other beings to mental afflictions. How are we going to increase goodness in the world? And then there's the Vajrayana yogi approach, which is a fast-track approach to find the natural nirvana, the natural Buddha nature within everything. And these are the 3 general approaches in Buddhism, and you'll see it reflected in many places in Scripture. For example, it's reflected in the 3 vehicles. So many of you know of Hinayana, the lower scope, Mahayana, the greater scope. And there's also Vajrayana, or the Diamond Way. If you were on a monastic debate ground, you would of course have to make the point that Vajrayana is a part of the Mahayana. It's a part of the greater way. It's just a technique that's a little bit different because it's mainly focused on what they call the result path. Going ahead and seeing the purity within everything, the Buddha nature with everything. So that's a little fast-track version, and we'll be talking about that more in our next class. Maitreya, the coming Buddha, in the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, says, non-attachment to objects is a path. Another is restraint from the distraction of obtaining them. Not abandoning beings, increasing virtues, and clearing away the obscurations are others. So there's a very tight verse for these three approaches that we're talking about. The first two lines are talking about aspects of the monastic approach, non-attachment and restraint. Referring to the Bodhisattva approach, Maitreya says, not abandoning beings, increasing virtue. And referring to the Vajrayana yogic approach, he says, clearing away the obscuration. Of course, bodhisattvas will apply highest wisdom, which is why, again, from a debate standpoint, the Mahayana, Vajrayana is part of Mahayana, but it's slightly different in the approaches. Generally, as practitioners, you would practice one of these at a time, and you would get kind of fluent in them. So like, okay, I know how to approach this. And you would work your way through all three. So a sincere spiritual practitioner who wants to travel to total enlightenment in one lifetime, they would train in all these different approaches. They would use all these different approaches. And just so there's no confusion, monks and nuns and bodhisattvas can be Vajrayana yogis. And you wouldn't necessarily know how somebody was approaching the world, what worldview they were using at each moment. This is about how you practice. So you can't really judge other people's practice because you have no idea what gear they're in. And then practically speaking, these methods are going to blur and reinforce each other. So there's not really hard lines because you have those days where you just can't get to highest worldview. You have those moments when somebody's really pressing your buttons and you need to downshift and go with, okay, the only approach I can do right now is be a bump on the log. I can just freeze and not react and not make it worse. Okay. I'm not ready to think about their natural Buddha nature. I can't do that one right now, but I can not make it worse. Okay. So you use these different approaches. And then, again, just to try to give you a practical, as a subtle point, you can even work in a lower gear with a higher motivation. So like we had the opportunity to do a long 3-year meditation retreat where we were withdrawing from the world to try to purify our own minds. But I don't think we could have done it over 1,000 days without having a strong motivation in mind. So every time the alarm went off for the 4 a.m. session, my first thought was, I have to find out if there's a cure for suffering. I have to find out if this path is true before I'd want to encourage anybody else to go through what can be a very tough process. So you can withdraw, but you can have a motivation. So theme and variations. Does that make sense? So today we're going to push ourselves into a higher gear. Today we're going to talk about the Bodhisattva approach. And this is how we increase goodness in the world. It's about, if the monastic approach was about not giving mental afflictions an inch, Now we're going to start taking back ground. Okay? How can we start to increase goodness in the world?
So James already mentioned two important things about the Bodhisattva approach. One is not abandoning living beings, right? Not abandoning other people. So in the monastic approach, it's basically like, okay, mental afflictions are the enemy. You're kind of triggering me. I have a problem with you. I withdraw, right? Because I'm going to be responsible for my mind, right? In the Bodhisattva approach, you have other methods, which we're going to talk about in this class, to defeat the mental affliction, right? And it involves putting your arms around people more than withdrawing, okay? So we're going to go through that. The other thing about this approach is that it's about creating more goodness in the world, okay? So in the monastic approach, you are trying to break negative cycles, right? Break the cycles of mental afflictions, right? Someone criticizes you, your natural thing is to criticize back. You stop doing that, you're breaking that. But in the Bodhisattva approach, the emphasis, yes, we break that, but then we also do the opposite, right? To add more goodness and more merit into the world, okay? You can see the difference, right? Yeah. So also in the Bodhisattva approach, the wish, the vision is much vaster. In the monastic approach, you realize, I don't want to suffer, and I want to eradicate my suffering and the causes of suffering. In the Bodhisattva approach, you expand that out to everyone. I don't want anyone to have to suffer. All suffering is unacceptable to me, okay? So it's a much wider vision. And then you decide to protect everyone as if they are a part of you. And we're going to talk about that a lot in this class. But Bodhisattva practice is different than just trying to help people in an ordinary way. You know, it's not like you're just a nice person or you volunteer at the food bank and, you're like a bodhisattva. Bodhisattva practice involves applying highest wisdom to what you're doing, right? A bodhisattva understands that every thought, every deed, every word that comes out of their mouth is a wish for their world, okay? Everything is an act of creation for the world. So to protect others, to help others, bodhisattvas take responsibility for all of that, all of their thoughts, all their actions, all their words. All of those things need to be infused with a wish to end suffering for others. It's infused with a responsibility too. This is your purpose now, right? So in this quest, you have two kind of, they're called wings, okay, two things that you need. You need wisdom and you need method, okay? So wisdom it's mental, it's insight, it's understanding, it's knowledge, okay? Method, it's a new term it's a Buddhist term basically. It means actions that you take, like methods that you do, practices that you do, okay? As opposed to wisdom, which is more mental, right? And your method as a bodhisattva is going to be acting in the opposite way of mental afflictions, okay? So say you have a horrible mental affliction, anger. Instead of just cutting it off, like I'm not going to get angry, you actively, intensively practice cultivating its opposite, patience, love, compassion, okay? That's the adding more goodness and merit to the world that we were talking about, okay? So that's method. Your wisdom eventually comes to see that there's no true inherent separation between you and others, okay? Despite the fact that it seems like there is, okay? The separation that we all perceive is a mental habit, okay? Mental habits come from causes. Put different causes in your mind, you will have a different mental habit. You'll have a different mental image, okay? So this wisdom and method, they're described as two wings of a bird, and you need them to fly to enlightenment. Okay. The Buddha, he says, method which lacks wisdom, or wisdom which lacks method, are ties which bind a bodhisattva. Wisdom which has method and method which has wisdom is freedom. So in bodhisattva practice, you give up being obsessed with your small self and you throw your arms around the world with wisdom, right?